Margaret Sullivan had always believed in kindness. At 72, with silver hair she wore proudly and eyes that still sparkled with warmth, she'd built her life on treating others with grace, even when it hurt. That Tuesday evening should have been lovely. Her son David had invited her to dinner at his home, something that happened less often since he'd married Patricia 5 years ago. Margaret had sewn a new dress for the occasion, pale blue like forget-me-nots, and brought homemade rolls, still warm in their basket. Patricia greeted her at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was 48, beautiful, in that polished way some women achieve, her auburn hair always perfect, her makeup flawless. But there was something cold beneath the surface, something Margaret had tried hard to overlook for David's sake. Dinner started pleasantly enough. David, her gentle 50-year-old son with his father's kind face, asked about her garden. Margaret spoke softly about her tomatoes, her roses, the hummingbirds that visited each morning. She noticed Patricia checking her watch, sighing. Then, it happened. Margaret reached for the soup tureen, her hands not as steady as they once were. She bumped it slightly, just slightly. A few drops splashed onto the white tablecloth. "I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered, reaching for her napkin. Patricia's face transformed. Before Margaret could react, her daughter-in-law grabbed the tureen and flung the scalding soup directly into Margaret's face. The pain was instant and terrible. Margaret gasped, soup dripping from her hair, burning her skin. Through the shock, she heard Patricia's voice, sharp and triumphant. "That's what you deserve. Clumsy old woman ruining everything." Margaret looked at her son through tears of pain and disbelief. David's face had gone pale. For a moment, just a moment, she thought he might defend her. "She's right, Mom," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. Those 3 words broke something in Margaret that the burning soup couldn't touch. She sat there, her face on fire, her heart shattered, and understood that she'd lost her son long ago. She just hadn't wanted to see it. Without a word, Margaret stood. Her hands trembled as she gathered her purse. Patricia smirked from across the table. David stared at his plate like a guilty child. Margaret walked to the bathroom, her face throbbing. She looked in the mirror at the red, blistering skin, the soup in her hair. She cleaned herself as best she could with their fancy hand towels, each touch bringing fresh pain. But she didn't cry. Not yet. She walked past the dining room. Neither of them looked up. Margaret let herself out the front door, closing it gently. Behind her, the way she'd taught David to close doors when he was small. In her car, Margaret sat in the darkness. The streetlights cast long shadows across the dashboard. Her face burned. Her heart ached worse. She thought about driving home, washing the soup from her hair, putting ice on her face, and trying to forget. But something stirred inside her, something that had been sleeping for too long. She reached for her phone and dialed. Her hands were steadier now. "Rebecca," she said when her daughter answered. "Something's happened. I need to tell you everything." Rebecca lived 2 states away, a successful attorney with her mother's moral backbone and her father's sharp mind. Margaret had always been proud of her daughter, though she saw her too rarely. "Mom, your voice sounds strange. Are you hurt?" Margaret touched her burning cheek. "Yes, but not just physically." She told Rebecca everything, not just about tonight, but about all of it. The years of small cruelties, the snide comments Patricia made when David wasn't listening, the way her son had slowly pulled away, canceling visits, forgetting her birthday last year, making excuses, the infidelity she'd accidentally discovered 6 months ago. She'd gone to their house to drop off David's favorite cookies, let herself in with the key she still had then. Patricia had been in the living room with a man Margaret had never seen before. They'd sprung apart, but not before Margaret understood exactly what she'd walked in on. Patricia had smiled that cold smile and said, "David knows I have friends over while he works. Don't you start trouble, Margaret." And Margaret, kind, gentle Margaret, had left without saying a word. She told herself it wasn't her place, that David was a grown man, that maybe she'd misunderstood, but she hadn't misunderstood anything. "Mom," Rebecca's voice was tight with controlled fury. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" "I wanted to keep the peace," Margaret said softly. "For David's sake. And what did keeping the peace get you? A face full of burning soup and a son who won't defend his own mother. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Through the windshield, she could see the warm light in David's windows. She imagined them in there. Patricia probably laughing about what she'd done. David trying to convince himself he'd made the right choice. Rebecca, Margaret said, I made that call because I'm done keeping quiet. But I need your help, and I need to do this the right way. Tell me what you need, Mom. Over the next hour, sitting in that car with her burning face, Margaret and Rebecca made a plan. Not out of hatred, but out of something quieter and more powerful. Justice mixed with heartbreak. Wrapped in a mother's wounded love, Rebecca made some calls. She knew people, lawyers, private investigators, people who owed her favors. Within 3 days, they had everything documented. Patricia's affair wasn't with one man, but 3. For the past 2 years, she'd been draining David's accounts, slowly transferring money to an account in her name alone. She'd even taken out a loan against the house without his knowledge. Using forged signatures, Margaret spent those 3 days nursing her burns, which were healing but would leave scars. She'd filed a police report about the assault, took photographs, went to the doctor and had everything documented. David never called. On the 4th day, Rebecca arrived. She hugged her mother carefully, avoiding the tender skin on her face, and they sat together at Margaret's small kitchen table. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? Rebecca asked. Margaret looked at her hands, weathered from years of gardening, cooking, caring for others. She thought about the young woman she'd been, burying David's father, the mother she'd been, raising her children with love, the widow she'd become, facing loneliness with grace, the woman she was now, tired of being kind to people who mistook kindness for weakness. I'm sure, she said. Rebecca served the papers herself. Margaret insisted on being there, though Rebecca tried to talk her out of it. They arrived at David's house on a Saturday morning. Margaret's face still showed signs of the burns, red marks that makeup couldn't fully hide. David answered the door in his bathrobe. His face went pale when he saw them. Mom, Rebecca, what these are for Patricia, Rebecca said, her voice professional and cold. Divorce papers on David's behalf. And these are assault charges against her, and these are fraud charges. We have evidence of everything. Patricia appeared behind David, her perfect composure cracking. You can't. We can. Rebecca cut her off. We have photographs of your affairs, bank records showing embezzlement, documents proving forgery, and most importantly, we have pictures of what you did to my mother. David's eyes finally met Margaret's. She saw the moment he truly looked at her face, at the marks that remained. She saw something break in him. Mom, you stood by and let it happen, Margaret said quietly. Your father taught you better. I taught you better. She was angry. She didn't mean, she meant every bit of it. Margaret interrupted, and there was steel in her voice now. And you agreed with her. You told me I deserved it, David. The silence that followed felt like years. Patricia tried to argue, to threaten, to charm. But Rebecca had done her homework too well. The evidence was ironclad. Patricia would face criminal charges for the assault and the fraud. The divorce would strip her of everything she'd been slowly stealing. As for David, Margaret had one more thing to say. I forgave you so many times, she told her son, her voice cracking now. Every canceled visit, every forgotten occasion, every time you chose her cruelty over my love. But this, I can't forgive. Not unless you earn it back. She turned to leave, Rebecca's arm supportive around her shoulders. Mom, wait, David called. I'm sorry. I was weak. I just wanted peace in my home. Margaret turned back one last time. You had peace, David. You had a mother who loved you unconditionally. But you wanted the wrong kind of peace. The kind that comes from going along to avoid conflict. Real peace comes from standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. The legal process took 6 months. Patricia fought it all the way, but the evidence was overwhelming. She lost everything. The divorce was granted. The assault charges led to probation and a restraining order. The fraud charges meant restitution and community service. David tried to reconcile with Margaret many times during those months. He sent flowers, letters, called weekly. Margaret didn't answer right away. She needed time. Time to heal, physically and emotionally. Time to understand that setting boundaries wasn't cruel. It was necessary. Time to recognize that she'd enabled David's weakness by always smoothing things over. Always being the one to forgive first, but she was still his mother. That hadn't changed. On what would have been her late husband's 80th birthday, Margaret finally invited David to her home. Just the two of them. She'd made his favorite meal, pot roast, with carrots and potatoes, the way she'd made it when he was young. David arrived with tears in his eyes. He'd aged in those 6 months, gray appearing at his temples, lines deeper around his eyes. "Thank you for seeing me," he whispered. They sat across from each other at her small table. Margaret's face had healed, though faint scars remained. She wore them without shame now. "I've been in therapy," David said, "trying to understand how I became someone who could treat you that way, who could watch you be hurt and not defend you." "And what have you learned?" Margaret asked gently. "That I was a coward, that I chose the path of least resistance even when it meant abandoning my values. My mother," he looked down at his hands, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just hope I become someone worthy of your love again." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Outside, she could hear birds singing in the garden. Life continuing. "I never stopped loving you," she finally said. "That's not something I can turn off, David. You're my son." But love doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. Love sometimes means stepping back and letting people face consequences. "I understand. Do you?" Margaret leaned forward. "Because I need you to understand something else. I'm not the same woman I was 6 months ago. I won't be silent to keep peace. I won't let cruelty slide. I won't sacrifice my dignity for your comfort. I wouldn't want you to," David said, and he meant it. They talked for hours that day. About everything. About how he'd met Patricia and been dazzled by her confidence, mistaking it for strength. About how the relationship had slowly become toxic, but he'd been too proud or too scared to admit it. About how he'd learned to tune out his own conscience to avoid conflict. And about how much he'd lost in the process. "Your father," Margaret said as they stood to clear the dishes, "used to say that character is what you do when doing the right thing costs you something. You forgot that for a while, I know. But people can change. People can grow. The question is, will you?" David did change. Slowly. Not overnight. Not dramatically. But in small, consistent ways. He rebuilt his life. He continued therapy. He volunteered at a senior center, helping elderly people who reminded him of his mother. He learned to speak up, to stand up, to value integrity over comfort. And over time, carefully, Margaret let him back into her life. Not all at once, not without boundaries, but she let him earn back her trust. Rebecca watched it all with protective eyes, ready to step in if her mother was hurt again. But David proved himself, day by day, month by month. 2 years late, Margaret stood in her garden on a spring morning. The tomatoes were coming in. The roses were in full bloom. A hummingbird hovered near the feeder she'd hung by the kitchen window. David arrived for their weekly Sunday breakfast, a tradition they'd rebuilt. He brought fresh bagels from the bakery she loved and the newspaper so they could do the crossword together. "Morning, Mom," he said, kissing her scarred cheek gently. She didn't flinch anymore. "Good morning, sweetheart." They sat in her garden, eating and talking and laughing. The wounds had healed, though the memory remained. But memory, Margaret had learned, could be a teacher rather than a torment. She'd learned that kindness didn't mean weakness, that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, that love could be strong enough to enforce boundaries, to demand respect, to say no. She'd learned that sometimes the people who need to hear, "That's what you deserve," are the ones saying it, not the ones they're saying it to. And she'd learned that even in the darkest moments, even when your face is burning and your heart is breaking, you always have a choice. You can accept mistreatment as your fate, or you can reach for the phone and call someone who loves you. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is ask for help. As the morning sun climbed higher and the garden filled with light, Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him. and saw someone who'd found his way back from darkness. Someone who'd learned the same hard lessons she had. That was enough. That was more than enough. It was everything.